college football nerds here to do a quick Texas preview. Got my co-host Josh. We like to get nerdy. We're going to get nerdy on this one. Going to talk a little bit of Texas football, and we did a little bit of a discussion earlier in the offseason. Is Texas back or not? Which I think is a different discussion in terms of what Texas expects. You know, the level of what it means to be back versus an actual season preview that we're going to do here. And just to remind y'all, we're not Texas fans, we're not Oklahoma fans, so we're generally impartial observers on this one. So this is a safe space for y'all. Feel free to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. We're not here to bring our flamethrowers. We're here to really more talk about the data and what we see more than gut feels and that sort of stuff. So we're not Texas haters. Josh, one of the big things that maybe some Texas haters are saying and have been saying all offseason is, yeah, Texas had a good season last year. They were 10-4. They were real close to winning the Big 12. They ended on a high note with the Georgia game, which was a great win, but they've lost all this production. And for me, I think that, you know, for a lot of teams, yes, if they lost a lot of production, they're going to take a step back. But the way that Texas has recruited, it's been on fire. And is it fair to say that a similar analogy is that they said this about Alabama for like 10 years in a row, and finally people just stopped saying in the offseason, Alabama lost these 7 guys on defense, so they're going to be terrible, because Alabama and Ohio State and a couple of other teams, I think Clemson's getting there as well, really do just reload instead of resetting?
It's definitely true to a large degree. And you can add another one to that list, and I think it's probably the underrated one, and that's Georgia. Georgia has been recruiting at a consistent top 5, top 10 level. And really, it's more the top 5 thing. And they last year lost talent, and maybe they weren't great at certain points, but they're a pretty darn good team. They lost one game to LSU where they struggled, which every team has a down game every now and then. And then darn near beat Alabama and walk their way into the playoff discussion themselves, right? So, yeah, when you've got top 5 recruiting classes, it's kind of a different animal. And I think a lot of times people don't understand what that means if they're not fans that have follow teams that typically recruit at that level, or, like if you're a fan in the Pac-12 where they don't ever recruit at a top 5 level outside USC, they just sort of see it like, well, that's just USC, and in USC being USC. Why was USC USC? It's because they were recruiting at that level consistently. And when you do that, you've got elite guys constantly in the program. And you've got guys that for most teams would start as a true freshman that are having to be learning as a freshman and maybe redshirting, and they're going to start as a true sophomore or a redshirt sophomore. And they reload because they've got guys that would normally start for most teams that just didn't see the field. I mean, it's just straight up, their backups are better than your starters a lot of times. And maybe you got a starter better than their starter, but their backup and their starter are really close in quality. That's where Texas is at. And it's hard to gauge Texas right now because they're kind of in that boat, and they lost a lot of production, but we've seen Alabama or Ohio State or Georgia lose production like this, and we never quite know what they're going to look like the next year. And sometimes they're awesome with a lot of new players. Sometimes they're not. Alabama in 2016, their defense was extremely good. They had a lot of actually new starters in that 2016 unit, and we just really wasn't seen coming. But then this past year, they had a lot of new starters, and they weren't very good, frankly, defensively. So it's hard to project, and I think that discussion is hugely important to understanding what Texas is or is not this upcoming year.
One of the other, I think, perceived positives for Texas this year is, you look at the games they lost, and look, I've already said this once. It's in another video. I'm taking Maryland off the table. It was week 1. Matt Canada's system is weird. He can really get them rolling, and we saw that Maryland had enough firepower to really, they were one actual play away, not hyperbole, dropped pass from beating Ohio State. And Ohio State was a good team last year. We all know that. So I'm taking Maryland off the table. That was an aberration. It was a weird game. Their other two regular season losses were Oklahoma State and West Virginia, and we saw West Virginia without Will Grier in the bowl game, and we know that Cornelius and Justice Hill, who I think Justice Hill was a bigger component of that offense, a bigger driver of their success than Cornelius, both those guys are gone too. So Oklahoma State, if you just look at those losses, Oklahoma State, West Virginia, you flip those to wins because of the guys that have left or because they're not reloading. And then you're looking at, maybe an 11-1 season if they lose to LSU, or maybe if they beat LSU, they go undefeated, because also Oklahoma, both you and I, much to RJ Young's chagrin, and he'll probably text me later, we think they might take a step back this year. That they might, they had an all-timer type offense for the last couple of years, and we don't think they're going to have it this year. And we do think their defense is going to be better, but maybe not enough to make up for the losses, the step back they're going to take on offense. So, am I looking at this the right way? That, like, man, these are the two L's they took last year could easily be looked at as wins this year.
It's definitely one way to look at it. And again, that's one of the great mysteries with Texas. And you picked up on one thing with Oklahoma. And we had the same discussion, interestingly, really with Michigan and Ohio State, that Michigan may or may not be better, but one of their biggest advantages is that Ohio State with Justin Fields is probably going to be more of a run-first team than they were with Haskins. And Michigan had struggled with the vertical passing attack of Haskins. So even if Ohio State is a similar quality team, it just suddenly looked a lot more doable for Michigan to win that game because they're probably not going to get hit on throwing the football. The same way Jalen Hurts is now the quarterback in Oklahoma. Hurts is with Hurts at the helm offensively. Alabama was never able to translate any of their offensive success, and I say that legitimately. I mean, they set records. I think 2016 season where they lost to Clemson at the end of the year, I think it was like their all-time highest scoring season ever. But when they played teams that were top 25 defensive teams, they couldn't score 20 points. And it's kind of been Hurts' problem. And I don't think it's really Hurts. It's that style of offense. Maybe it's him not being able to run more of a vertical passing attack, but that run-first offense tends to kill weak teams and struggle against good ones. Oklahoma loses 4 NFL linemen. They got a run-first quarterback behind that. This all may go out the window because there's talk now that Rattler might even pass Hurts, but I think that's almost a bad sign in terms of what our earlier concerns were with Hurts. They may be on the decline. Again, Oklahoma State, they may be falling back. West Virginia may be falling back. Iowa State is pumped up by a lot of people. I know you were super high on David Montgomery out of Iowa State, and you think that's going to be a massive loss. We didn't do an NFL draft pick preview, but if we did, that's probably one of the big things we would have talked about. We did one a while back, by the way. Said this guy named Eddie Jackson was going to be really good and shouldn't have been drafted late, but nobody watched that either. The trick to me with Texas, though, is when you talk the 3 L's, you got to talk about the wins. Texas had 10 games decided by 1 score or less. 10. That's hard to do, really, in college football. The truth is, most games are not decided by a score. Most games do kind of swing pretty hard one way or the other. I'm less concerned with Texas by the games they lost, frankly, than the games that they won. Because the games they lost were the teams that I think are going to take a step back. And I think Texas doesn't have to be better to win those games. They can take a step back defensively, take a step forward offensively, be about the same and win it because they don't have quite the same competition. That's college football. Every year is different. You don't always have to be as good as you were the year prior to win a conference championship. Some years the conferences are tougher than others. My concern was how many of those wins against rough teams were close. Texas had no business beating Kansas State by 5. Texas had no business beating Tulsa by 7. They had no business beating Kansas by 7. They had no business beating Texas Tech by 7. Baylor by 6. It's not a one-off. They struggled in way too many games against teams that they really should have beaten by a large margin. And that concerns me because if the defense does take a step back, defenses are the things really, and that's why they say defense wins championships, that buoy you against a bad game making you lose. Because it's really hard to do what Oklahoma did last year, where you won shootout after shootout against bad teams because your defense can't get a stop. you're relying on way too much luck. You're relying on that drop pass by Maryland against Ohio State when their defense couldn't stop Maryland, and it usually doesn't work your way, at least not 7 times. If Texas's defense takes a step back, my concern with Texas is almost more losing to teams that they should beat than it is the teams that they lost to last year. And that's before we get into 2 big hurdles on their schedule, which is 1, they got to play LSU, okay? And 2, all this too is riding on Sam Ehlinger and where he is and how good he is. So, you got to kind of take those things in connotation too. How much of a step forward are they going to take? How much is that going to matter with a non-conference game that won't have implications really for the Big 12 title hunt? But if they're making a playoff scenario, this is a major roadblock maybe in Texas's path where they could be pretty good and just get hit by a good LSU team. I think all that matters.
Yeah, and I'll throw another one in there. I think TCU is going to be better this year than they were last year. A lot of TCU's struggles last year were because they were decimated by injury. So that's another team that you talk about, not necessarily teams getting better in the Big 12, but just one thing happening a little differently last year, and Texas as a team looks a lot different. You touched on LSU. I don't necessarily think, we keep talking about these benchmark out-of-conference games to know how to compare other teams and look at schedules and see how hard they were and how we should look at teams at the end of the year. LSU is a game for me that I love that they scheduled it. I love these 2 teams are playing, but I don't think it's a huge negative if Texas loses. And I'm not even saying they're going to lose. We haven't picked that game. We haven't done anything like that. But because it's out of conference, I think they can still easily win the Big 12 and take a loss to LSU. The thing that I like about Texas's schedule, though, is they're, and it's, look, I know y'all going to get at me in the comments. We don't know who's going to be good and who's going to be bad. But at this point, if we're looking at kind of known quantities, I like how their tough games are spread out. So they get a kind of a primer on week 1 with La Tech, and then they get LSU. And then they get another sort of primer with Rice, Oklahoma State, West Virginia, leading up to the game against Oklahoma. And I don't think West Virginia's going to be that great this year. And then they get a break with Kansas. And even ending the season, Iowa State is in there. That's going to be the other tough game for them. But I like the fact that some of these games are spread out, whereas a team like Georgia, who we talked about in our other preview, they don't necessarily have that many tough games, but a lot of them are kind of close together. So do you think some of that comes into play with Texas this year in terms of maybe sort of shaking off the cobwebs of a close loss or whatever and being able to focus instead of having something like an Ohio State who ends the season with Penn State and Michigan?
I think so. It's always hard for teams to play a lot of really tough opponents close, and there's a lot of reasons for it. 1, it's hard to be mentally focused for a lot of tough games in a row. 2, you tend to get beat up. When you're in tough games against really good opponents, sometimes they make the statement that it's more physical. I think it's more than that. You've got to be more physical. You're relying on your star players more. And in a lot of games when you're playing like a Rice, you don't want to throw the ball to Colin Johnson 80 times in that game. You don't want to have Sam Ehlinger run the ball 30 times against Rice. You're going to do everything you can to protect him. And then maybe you beat Rice by 2 touchdowns. But you're going to do it by exposing your key players to as little injury as possible and exposing your defensive playbook and blitz packages as little as possible to your opponents. When you play big teams, you got to show your hand more in terms of play selection, and you got to expose your big players to a lot of big shots. And so you tend to get guys that matter more, nicked more. And I think sometimes, too, when you've got guys like Ehlinger that's going to be leaned on probably as a runner at times in these big games, they tend to get sort of overused against big opponents. And
that's what got him last
year. Yeah, I mean, that really did happen, I think. Those guys take a lot of hits. And it's not really that the game's more physical, quote unquote. It's just that guy needs to get more touches in that scenario. And so that guy gets banged up. And one of the biggest causes of injury for any game is when guys get tired. So if you get guys that you're leaning on all game, those tend to be the guys, like Deebo Samuel at South Carolina, that get hurt because it's not even just exposure with number of snaps. I think it's just at a certain point, once you pass a certain number of snaps, the injury rate for those guys goes up substantially.
All right, so I think it's fair to discuss Texas in the context of teams that are vying for a playoff spot, especially given how they ended the season last year and how you and I think they're going to kind of reload. Looking at their schedule and how we think the Big 12 might collectively take a step back this year, is that good or bad? Because on the good side, you've got the fact that they might have an easier path to a clean record. But on the bad side, if the Big 12 does take a step back, they have no margin for error, right?
Again, it always depends on what everyone else is doing. College football, people get obsessed, right, with comparing one year to another year and what happened in one year and why X playoff team got in one year and didn't get in and this team didn't get off and whatever, right? I mean, Ohio State gets in with when they're not the conference champion, and it was because of what Penn State did. And the fact that they lost 2 games that year. Alabama gets in, not even winning their own division, and it was due to the fact that you were comparing 1 loss to 2 losses and the magnitude of those losses. Every year is its own thing. This season, you got a pretty good chance that the SEC champion is going to get in. It's going to be Alabama or Georgia or LSU. If Texas beats LSU, it's probably not LSU. I mean, unless they lose to Texas and run the gauntlet, but that seems unlikely. So you probably have the SEC champion in. You probably have Clemson in. Out of the Big Ten, it's likely that Ohio State or Michigan's going to be pretty highly ranked. But once you get past those 3, I don't think there's a lot of respect this year for the Pac-12. And unless they blow the doors off, I don't think that's going to change. I think, even let's say the Auburn-Oregon game is really a terrible game for the Pac-12 because Auburn is not expected to be overly competitive. But if Auburn were to beat Oregon, it could kind of crater.
It's the same thing that happened last year with Auburn and Washington.
Right. It kind of cratered the entire conference's reputation. So the only other team really that's really competitive in that slot, I mean, I'm assuming similar records, right, or the same record, it's really Notre Dame. And Notre Dame has a chance with a Georgia win to sneak in, and we've talked about this quite a bit, that they're really sneakily sitting in a good position where if they were to beat Georgia, or Michigan, either one, they split those and they go 11-1, they could easily get in. Now, Texas playing LSU is a huge boon. If the Texas wasn't playing LSU, they would have no margin for error. It'd be a hard comparison, but I think the conference championship game would probably bail Texas out. If they split LSU in Oklahoma in the regular season, and then they win the conference title, let's say against Oklahoma, I've always said it's really not the conference championship thing, and we did a whole video on this. I think it's kind of dumb that we focus so much on, well, you're a conference champions. The Big 12 does a round robin. I mean, you're a conference champion, it's a title, great, wonderful. The thing that really matters about the conference championships is Oklahoma had to beat a top-shelf Texas team to win the conference. Alabama had to beat a top-shelf Georgia team to win their conference. That's the thing that Notre Dame would be missing in this scenario, is that Texas would probably be beating what would still, hopefully, if you're Texas, be a top 10 Oklahoma team, while Notre Dame's sitting at home watching on television. That's what would get, in my view, Texas in ahead of Notre Dame, because Texas at that point is 12-1, Notre Dame is 11-1, and Notre Dame's 2 probably biggest games, at least in theory, right this second, they go 1-1 in them, and now Texas has the opportunity to go 2-1, and that extra win is what probably would get Texas in over Notre Dame in that scenario. So I do think if if Texas splits the LSU and Oklahoma game and then wins the conference, yeah, I think there's a very, very good chance they get in. Again, the SEC and the ACC Clemson is going to get the benefit of the doubt over them. Even if the Big Ten gets in, which may or may not happen, they probably got a little bit of an edge over Notre Dame because the conference championship opportunity, and the Pac-12 is not getting a ton of respect. That probably, just like Oklahoma slipping in last year, gives Texas the ability to slip into the playoff discussion.
Okay, there's two ways to look at this. Like, because everybody plays everybody, and then you got 1 and 2 in the conference championship game, it kind of sucks because, like, if Oklahoma and Texas were in the same division and Texas beat Oklahoma, then they would eliminate them and wouldn't have to play them again. But on the flip side, if Oklahoma and Texas are so far out ahead of everybody else in the Big 12, even if Oklahoma's not great, Texas will get a higher ranked opponent because Oklahoma by default will have a lot of wins under their belt. So I like it either way. I'm going to go ahead and do my pick for them this year. For me, I don't know that I'm picking them to lose to LSU or to beat LSU. I do think they split. Probably a split is the best that they can hope for with those two games. I am high on Texas in terms of getting back. I think I want to see another couple of 10-win seasons or something like a playoff berth before I say they're back, based on Texas standards. I'm gonna go 10-2, and I don't necessarily, like we said in the open, I don't necessarily think they're going to be. They may not be better than last year's team. They might actually be a little bit worse. It depends on how those new faces turn out. I think they're going to be 10-2 with a little bit of fool's gold because I think the Big 12 takes a step back this year. But look, we picked Texas to lose to Georgia, and we were wrong on that count. So I could be wrong on this count. What do you think for Texas' schedule this season? How do you think they're going to how do you think they're going to fare?
Texas this season, to me, I think they're set up to be very successful, but I'm a little skittish about their performance last year and how things may turn if they take a bit of a step back. Again, it really is that scenario where, yeah, you may beat some of the teams you lost to last season, but you may also drop one that you shouldn't have. And, we were wrong in the Georgia-Texas preview. We thought Georgia would beat Texas, but we run a computer model, and our computer model had that game Georgia 32, Texas 26. I really want to emphasize a point there. It was wrong in how much Georgia would score. It thought Georgia would score 32. They only scored 21. But it was dead on with what it thought Texas was going to score against Georgia. And so the thing that overperformed based on our statistical projections last season was the defense. The offense was consistent in that game with what we were expecting them to look like going into it. And again, our model already said that was a one-score game. The defense, the thing that overperformed is the thing that you're losing. The offense, which was good, I don't think was necessarily elite. And if the defense isn't able to carry that load, given where Texas was at last year and the number of games they dropped that they shouldn't have, I think they're probably going to happen again. So, personally, I see Texas as a 10-2 team. I think it's possible, even likely, in my view, that they split LSU and Oklahoma. I think more likely than not, frankly, maybe at this point that LSU wins the game. I don't know. We haven't compared them, and I haven't seen anything from either team on the field yet. But, that's my gut reaction based on the fact, really, just that I think LSU is going to be better than they were last year. I think they're one of the sleeper teams nationally. I think, that let's trade away. I'm still saying that right now I'm thinking Texas beats Oklahoma. The trick is I think Texas is just going to slip up and lose one they shouldn't lose. And the unfortunate truth is no two-loss team has ever made the playoff. And I'm not sure that they ever will make the playoff. So I think that's going to be a really good season. And we had this whole discussion about whether or not Texas was back. I think if Texas goes 10-2 and they win the Big 12, you got to be really happy with it. But I'm not sure where the fans are going to be with Texas going 10-2 and winning the Big 12 if they don't end up in the playoff. So I'm almost curious, and maybe this will be your question for the end of the show. How happy would Texas fans be if they go 10-2, beat Oklahoma, win the Big 12, but they get left out of the playoff because they lose to somebody they shouldn't lose to?
I think kind of like the question we posed to Michigan fans, I think, and Texas fans, this is for y'all to answer. I mean, would you be okay with a 10-2 regular season and winning the Big 12 if you meant you take that now, but it takes the playoffs off the table? I think they would be okay with it because they've seen Oklahoma win their conference so many times that it's time. That's, to me, the next step for them. It's not necessarily the playoffs. It's not a national championship yet. They'll get there, and maybe they do get there this year, but you got to win your conference first. And, for me, I think that 10-2, you're right. You can't lose. And I'll say this. They can't beat all the good teams and lose to one team they're not supposed to. And again, we don't know what the field's going to look like at the end of the year, but because in my mind, and this is just a projection, I could be wrong, and I'll admit it mid-season, I think because the Big 12 is not going to be as good, they're not going to have many marquee games on their schedule, so one loss to West Virginia or Oklahoma State might kick them out of the running. So they do have the advantage of still being able to win their conference, but I definitely think 2 kicks them out.
And, it's important to remember, too, right, when we say that the Big 12 may not be as good, all that matters is the Big 12 isn't perceived as good from the media. Because if the Big 12 isn't perceived as good, that's going to hurt you in the playoffs, regardless of how good they are or not. All that matters is how the media and the pundits and the playoff committee views it. And I think at the end of the year, because you're probably going to have a lot more 8-4, 9-3 type teams, less ranked teams, that's going to really hurt Texas if they drop a game.
And that's why we keep saying, let's move away from the 9-game conference schedule. Let's do 8-game conference schedules and mandate 2 out-of-conference games. And that way we'll know. We'll have enough data to know how good a given conference schedule is or is not. All right, y'all, that's going to be it for us on our Texas season preview. Please remember our question that we talked about earlier. Would you prefer, Texas fans, would you take right now a 10-2 guaranteed season if it guaranteed that you wouldn't be in the playoffs, but you would win your conference? So I guess we could say 11-2. And I don't know if Texas ends up playing another SEC team in the end of this season. I might go ahead and just put my vote in for Texas after what happened last year. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Have a great week. And God bless.